have an ambitious plan for the next hour. My plan is to take you on a very quick survey of 4 or 5 major theoretical perspectives informing contemporary international relations theory, all right? And that survey is going to cover realism, neoliberal institutionalism, systems theory, constructivism, securitization, and my personal favorite, rationalism. Does anybody have experience in like introductory IR classes? It's totally okay if you don't. Some, so not a lot, that's no problem. We're going to basically be assuming that everybody's starting from 0. So, we're going to familiarize you, that's you, the students, right there, with some of the fundamental theoretical perspectives. There they are. I'm going to be paying a little bit less attention to constructivism and critical perspectives. The reason for that is that you're going to be getting a healthy dose of critical perspectives on IR from subsequent lecturers. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time going through these top-level analyses. And I'm going to do my best to show how these perspectives inform our representations of IR within debate. We, I think, are frequently making liberal institutionalist arguments, realist arguments, rationalist arguments without fully understanding the theoretical perspectives that inform those arguments. And because some of these perspectives are not so common in debate, rationalism because it's highly technical and systemic theories because they're fairly new, I want to at least expose you to these ideas and maybe suggest a couple of ways that they could be creatively used in a parlor. Sorry that you're on. Or there are chairs up here if you so choose. But if you're good down there, that's fine. Okay. So, as always, we start with our definitions and our units of analysis. Everybody familiar with the concept of a state? Know what a state is? Ever so quickly, who could give me a sense of what a state is? What are some of the fundamental characteristics of a state?
Sovereign territory.
Okay, yes. So, international legal recognition by the international community, so by other states, clearly demarcated territory. What else? John?
Highest entity of really legally binding authority.
Okay, good. So, theoretically, the state has legal authority over the entirety of its demarcated territory, right? It is theoretically the only actor that's in charge within its boundaries. It's supposed to have the monopoly on violence. We know that that's not necessarily true of all or even most states. Lots of states were created by legal fiat following the period of decolonization in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, don't have a full monopoly on violence within their territory. And the international community, we mean all states. We mean international organizations. So the UN, WTO, the EU, the AU, etc. Some of these are diplomatic communities. Some of these are more like economic unions. Some of these are defense unions. So the international community. The definition of international community is expanding to include global civil society. So these are people and organizations that constructivists call norm entrepreneurs. People who pressure international organizations and states to change behavior in ways that benefit large amounts of people. And of course, multinational corporations. Immensely powerful actors that don't really receive due attention in a lot of just purely state-level analyses of international relations. All right. We're starting with realism. And we start with realism because realism informed many of the subsequent and competing perspectives. Realism was the dominant analysis of IR, was the dominant theoretical perspective in IR following World War II. Is anybody familiar with the distinction between classical and neo-realism?
Isn't one that everything is based on anarchy and the other is based on self-interest?
Yeah, really good. That's exactly right. So this is a distinction that we make when we talk about realism, and I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on neo-realism because that has, we've sort of outgrown classical realism in a lot of ways. So classical realism is simply the argument that states are competitive because people are inherently self-interested and competitive. Some classical realist authors include people like E.H. Carr, as well as Hans Morgenthau. That's classical realism. Neo-realism is a little bit more agnostic about whether or not human beings are inherently cooperative or self-interested or some mixture of both. Neo-realism makes the argument that the international system, the international environment, is fundamentally anarchic. So what that means is that neo-realists think there is no credible central authority that can constrain state behavior. So the United Nations, all of its bureaucracies and sub-organizations are not good at binding states to consistent norms of behavior. A neo-realist would say, point to the situation in Syria and say, if international organizations were actually credible institutions for constraining state behavior, 625,000 civilians would not be dead. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay. And for realist, states are the primary units of analysis. They're the most important actors in the international environment. Neo-realists say that yes, of course, international institutions exist. They make small changes within the international architecture. But international organizations are run for the benefit of the most powerful states. IOs are proxies for the most powerful states. That is the neo-realist understanding of an international organization. Realists make the argument that all states want to achieve just a couple of things. It's a grim but also beautifully simple worldview. Do you know what realists think all states want to achieve?
Domination.
A certain branch of realists think that that is true, yes.
Security.
Security, exactly. So, you're both right. So, Kenneth Waltz, who unfortunately recently passed away, wrote in 1979 a seminal work called Theory of International Politics. And this is the kind of first major coherent text in the neo-realist tradition. Neo-realism is divided into two branches. Defensive realism, that's Waltz. Offensive realism, a gentleman named John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago. He spells out offensive realism in a really good, accessible book published in 2001. It's called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So, Waltz and the defensive realists, they say that all states fundamentally desire survival. Not necessarily domination, but survival. And so, they build up material defenses in order to achieve security vis-a-vis other states. So, for defensive realists, there is in fact an objective minimum amount of security that states should be happy with. The problem for defensive realists, or that defensive realists point out, is that it's very difficult to distinguish between offensive and defensive measures in security buildups. It can be hard to distinguish between offensive and defensive weapons. And so, what one state views as critical to its survival, building up defensive material capabilities, another state interprets as offensive. And that leads to something called the security dilemma, where neither state actually wants to fight or antagonize the other, but because of the anarchy of the international system, they end up doing so via the security dilemma. Now, Mearsheimer and the offensive realists say that states go beyond just wanting survival, they want improved standing relative to all other states. So for Mearsheimer, states are constantly in a state of competition. The logical conclusion of that is that all states desire hegemony, at least regional hegemony. So that's a major debate within realism. Now, for realists, the question is, how do states achieve survival? Anybody?
Coercion.
What's that?
Coercion.
Coercion in what way?
Economic, military.
Good. Economic and military coercion, economic and military power. Cash and guns. Those are the most important variables for realists in explaining state survival, cash and guns. also referred to as self-help, right? States can't rely on the international community, and so they must build up their own hard power and economic power. And for many of the most kind of hardcore offensive realists, economic power is just a proxy for hard power. It's a latent capability that can be turned into hard power later. Got that? Okay. Good so far? All right. So we've already been over, it was the foundational theory of IR. It still strongly influences neoliberal institutionalism, rationalism. Here are some of the major authors. Morgenthau, Waltz. Stephen Walt was one of Kenneth Waltz's students. He runs an excellent blog on foreign policy. As in, it's on foreignpolicy.com. I don't think it's called like Walt's World or anything like that. But it's a very good blog. He's a very accessible author. And of course, Mearsheimer. I don't know if Mearsheimer. All right, are we ready to advance our understanding of IR? New theoretical perspectives, breaking ground. Oh, wait, we have to cover realism debate ever so quickly. So yeah, right, most interstate war impact scenarios, obviously, war inevitable claims tend to be informed by nakedly realist visions of the world. So, for example, you may have come across at some point, war with China inevitable arguments. Those are neo-realist visions of how the world operates. Classic neo-realist arguments. And claims about the benefits of U.S. hegemony, its ability to constrain other states, rival states, balance against other states. Classic realist arguments in debate. Okay. Liberal institutionalism. Anybody know who else or what other actors are important in explaining international politics for the liberal institutionalists? It's not just states.
Nations.
Institutions.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So like what kind? Totally. Yeah, but like what types of institutions would you say are most important to liberal institutions?
Multilateral institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So multinational corporations, of course, with their lobbying power and ability to influence state decisions, or alleged ability to influence state decisions, very important to liberal institutionalists. International institutions and their bureaucracies, multilateral institutions, that's exactly right. Particularly financial international institutions, World Bank, IMF, those types. Anybody have an educated guess or know what most liberal institutionalists say the role of trade is in either causing or tempering conflict between states?
Making conflicts unthinkable.
Yeah, unthinkable, or at least substantially less likely. Why is that?
Tied together because of these institutions, or constrained by it.
Yeah, good. So complex trade networks, they raise the cost of conflict, right? Very classic argument. The realists on one side of the room say, war with China inevitable, and the liberal institutionalists on the other say, no, the costs of war are too high, economic interdependence. Means that the two states will never go to war because they're financially dependent on one another. They would destroy their own economies if they were to go to war. Classic liberal institutionalist piece of impact defense. Okay, the role of international institutions. So we got the role of trade. What role do international institutions play in, usually, for the liberal institutionalist tempering conflict?
Norm proliferation?
Norm proliferation?
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. So, forums for regular interaction and communication between states. So the realists say the international institutions don't matter, they're ineffective, and then they point randomly to a couple of conflicts that were not solved, okay, many conflicts that were not solved by any party's involvement in an international institution. The liberal institutionalists say, actually, these are very, very important places for states to come together and communicate with one another in a way that could, at least theoretically, help states explain, say, their defensive buildups, which in a nakedly realist vision of the world would only cause the security dilemma. Also, like you say, norm proliferation creates rules and expectations. Iterated interaction between states, repeated interaction between states, creates expectations about how a state is going to behave under certain circumstances. International institutions enable expectations to form. Theoretically as well, independent monitoring mechanisms. So lots and lots and lots of UN organizations that, and not just UN organizations, organizations outside of the UN, that monitor, say, human rights violations, degree of democratization, probability of two states going to war, probability of a state fighting an internal conflict. All of these serve to increase clarity, increase knowledge about states' behaviors and intentions, create norm proliferation, rules and expectations, constrain state behavior. It's maybe not a great example. I don't know when the AU has ever constrained the behavior of warring parties, but you get the idea. State A won't attack B because it would hinder B or A's accession to the EU or some other international organization or diminish its credibility in front of an international organization, and that actor values its standing in the organization more than it values the payoff. Role of trade between states, role of international institutions, the neoliberal institutionalists. The interesting thing about the neoliberal institutionalists is that they don't necessarily disagree that the world is fundamentally anarchic, but they say that if you build the appropriate institutions, they can become credible enforcement mechanisms that modify and constrain state behavior. We doing okay still? Yeah. A couple of the major authors within this vein, and you know, I had to, oh god, I have to talk about democratic peace. All right, sorry, real quick. A classic liberal institutionalist argument, the democratic peace. You have probably all at some point come across the Diamond in 95 card. Democracy is good because democracies don't go to war with each other, commit ethnic cleansings, plunder their environment. It's all true. So one of the great, I guess, contributions of liberal institutionalism to our understanding of international relations is the democratic peace, proven over and over and over again. If anybody wants to write an article, please don't write about the democratic peace. We get it. So, shown democracies don't fight each other. There is, interestingly, a couple of competing explanations for why. Right? So we know that this is an empirical reality. There are debates about why. Why do you think democracies don't fight each other?
Because democracies usually have more economic and interdependence between one another than countries with different classes systems.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. Alex?
The higher cost for the leaders to go to war because the population backlashes if there's conflict.
Yes. Very good. There's one more major one.
Because they've already previously gone to war with one another?
That's actually. So that is a heterodox reading of the democratic peace theory, but it is also a pretty good one.
Voters actually bear the cost of conflict. If they can control it, they'll try to avoid it.
Very good. Exactly right. So there are competing explanations for why. Size of selectorate is a shorthand for the argument that a couple of you have made. So leaders in democracies are accountable for the decisions that they make when they decide to initiate war, theoretically. And so the selectorate, which is the constituency that is able to remove a leader from office or keep that leader in office, has to be convinced of the utility of going to war. And so as more and more people are involved in the selectorate, right, the selectorate becomes the electorate in a democracy, it's harder and harder to convince people of the payoff of going to war. Whereas if you are an autocratic leader and you have a small selectorate, there's a group of 30 people that you have to keep happy. As long as you can keep them in your patronage network, you got to work with them. It's an exaggeration. But you have to convince far fewer people of the utility of going to war. And you don't necessarily bear the cost for going to war. Of course, the cost to a leader who initiates and fails in a war could be higher for somebody in an autocratic country, because in a democracy you just get kicked out of office and then you go on a book tour, right? If you lose office in an autocratic country, you're usually killed, imprisoned, or exiled for the rest of your life. You have to live on the beach in Saudi Arabia. Okay. Another one is ideological compatibility. That's the only one we missed, and it's also a fairly straightforward one. Democracies just happen to identify with other democracies, and they probably have better means of communicating their intentions in ways that would prevent the security problem. Okay. hesitate to call Grieco a liberal institutionalist. He's been a great intermediary translator between neo-realists and neoliberal institutionalists. I would strongly recommend starting with Grieco if you are looking for a really straightforward comparison between these two theoretical perspectives. David Bierce, I guess, has another competing explanation for the democratic piece. He calls it the commercial institutional piece, very much like what Brandon was saying. Dresner. Anybody ever heard of the book International Politics of the Zombies?
Yeah, I actually saw him.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so Dresner is hilarious and also has an excellent blog that he keeps on foreign policy. He's a classical institutionalist author. There we go. He apparently just finished a new one called The System Worked. It's about the global financial crisis. All right. Are we ready? Going on? Rationalism. Okay. Anybody come across this perspective in the past? Had it explained to them in an IR class, read about it? Okay. So, rationalism is a highly technical perspective, and I mean highly technical perspective in the sense that the most groundbreaking work has been game theoretic in nature. And it has built toward this really, really helpful model called the bargaining model of warfare. So this model about how wars start in the international system, a couple of assumptions. War is costly no matter what. Right? Blood and treasure, of course. Because war is costly, leaders prefer to bargain peacefully when they have disputes. And leaders are rational, which means that with the information they have, they make the best decisions that they can for themselves. They are utility maximized. So, in some ways, these are kind of powerful assumptions. Like, they seem so straightforward, but they're actually kind of powerful assumptions. The rationalist perspective says that leaders don't go to war because they're crazy, or because they're enraged, or because they're, don't say it, rational, right? Whereas we frequently, I think, jump to that argument, especially when constructing impact scenarios, because it's a useful and I think intellectually very lazy way to get to our nuclear war scenarios. And Matt goes out the door, no more rationality. Very common, happens a lot. So not consistent with the rationalist perspective. The other thing is that it's not consistent with the classical realist perspective that people are inherently competitive. It says that actually people prefer to bargain because it's lower cost. Now, James Fearon of Stanford wrote a 1995 article in the journal International Organization called Rationalist Explanations for War that kicked this whole great thing off. And Fearon says that there are three main things that cause war. Those are misperception and miscalculation, commitment problems, and indivisible goods. So, here is the argument in a nutshell. Two actors are disagreeing over how to, say, divide a tract of land. Okay, very valuable, nice land. You can farm on it, you can build some condos, whatever. In a world of perfect information, the two actors would each know their probability of winning a war were they to go to war over that tract of land, right? So say one state knows that it's got a 50% probability of winning, the other state knows that it's got a 50% probability of winning. What's the most rational and lowest cost thing to do? Divide the land 50-50, right? And sidestep war altogether. But that doesn't happen. Part of the reason that doesn't happen, misperception and miscalculation. Leaders know their state's abilities in warfare, they know their capabilities, but it's hard to know another state's capabilities, because most states are not running around advertising exactly what their strategies are, what the sickest cool weapons that they've got now are. That's why we have R&D departments that are very secret. So, misperception, miscalculation. Both states objectively have a 50-50 chance of winning a war on a piece of land. Each state thinks, because of misperception, miscalculation, that it has a 60% chance of winning. That means that the bargaining range narrows dramatically. In fact, it's eliminated, and you get war. Now, another very interesting and powerful component of this model, commitment problem. Anybody heard this phrase? Yeah.
Isn't it when you have like ties to your allies that you have to fulfill?
No, I mean that is a problem with making commitments, but that is not the commitment problem. Yeah.
Is that the ones like since there's like no credible bargaining actor, there's no like overarching international body that can enforce set agreements. States has to like make agreements in their favor so they know like really will deter the other state from like taking back their word against the agreement.
Yeah, exactly. So for anybody who didn't hear, a commitment problem is actually a concept that we sort of imported from neo-realism, or at least it jives with the neo-realistic perspective that there is no credible enforcement mechanism in the international system. So what that means is that when a state promises to another state, I'm not going to fight you, or I'm not going to arm, or I'm not going to try to, I don't know, disrupt your alliances, because there is no credible international enforcement mechanism, those commitments are not credible. And so, even in a world of perfect information, where each side knows that they've got, say, a 50-50 chance of winning, each side is also afraid that their relative probability of winning will diminish. At some point in the future, something can happen to change the 50-50 split to a 40-60 split, which means that it's better to fight now than risk being disadvantaged later, because that later disadvantage is far worse than the cost of war now. That's the commitment problem. And that's how war can happen even in a world of perfect information. Also, indivisible goods. This is a very short part of the article and not something that gets really expanded on very much. Fearon says that it is at least theoretically possible that a good that is being bargained over cannot be equitably divided. I'm not exactly sure what types of goods can't be divided, but if James Fearon says it's theoretically possible. Okay, so that's the bargaining model of warfare. James Fearon, Dan Ryder, Robert Powell, Dave Lake, all very, very good authors within the bargaining model tradition. Ryder actually wrote a book in 2009 called How Wars End that has a very similar rationalist approach. And it's exciting because it means that the rationalist perspective has a falsifiable and unified theory of how wars start and end, which is pretty cool. But also, Ryder says that wars serve a very important purpose in that they reveal information. That is Ryder's argument. Wars reveal information about relative capabilities. And once enough information has been provided to all sides, that's how wars end. It's really simple, right? But it's also very powerful. So that's a little bit on the rationalist perspective. Not something that we use very frequently in debate, something that I would, I guess personally would love to see more of, because I think that it would be a much more rigorous construction of our impact scenarios. So if you're interested in any of these authors, strongly recommend checking them out. Don't get caught up in the formal modeling and all the math, because there's like, in all of these articles, there's like 15 pages of math. But you can understand it without it. All right. Okay, moving on. Constructivism. Here we go. Okay, the constructivist perspective. Alex Wendt, now of Ohio State. Classic 1992 piece, Anarchy is What States Make. So the constructivist perspective is a really interesting one in that it posits that realists of both the neo and the classical variety, the defensive and the offensive variety, institutionalists of all sorts, all take into account material factors and almost only material factors in explaining international interactions. Constructivists say that the international environment may not actually be fundamentally and objectively anarchic and competitive. They say that rather, state behavior is a product of repeated state interactions. So perceptions and identities are not set from the beginning to necessarily be competitive. States do not necessarily have to seek self-help. It's not all predetermined by the structure of the international environment. Wendt, for example, makes the argument that it is possible for states to think in terms of collective security, or to see how the security of one state might benefit its own security, rather than a purely individual state focus. So, interests, identities, norms formed through processes of interactions between states. So what that means is that states behave in realist fashion because the elites of states think in realist terms, not because the international environment compels states to behave in this way. Does that make sense? Okay. So, a very recent piece by a guy named Bear Brommuller at Ohio State. An excellent book just came out. It's called Great Powers in the International System. It's a really cool, simple model that does a ton of work to bridge neo-realist, neoliberal institutionalist, and constructivist insights. Because one of the problems that constructivism has faced, and one of the criticisms that it has faced, is that it doesn't articulate a falsifiable theory of international relations, right? Which is to say that constructivists are very good at pointing to phenomena in the international environment and saying realism doesn't explain this, neoliberal institutionalism doesn't explain this, you don't account for everything, which is true. And so Brommuller has this very simple model called the nested politics model. Sovereignty nested within hierarchy, nested within anarchy. It says there are only a couple of major actors. Constituents, states, and the international environment or interactions between states. And what he says with this nested politics model is that the worldviews of constituents, and remember, the size of a constituency can vary greatly, right? The size of a selectorate can be a democracy or can be a very small group of people making decisions. The worldview of constituents informs the behavior of states and how the states interact with one another in the international system. That changes the nature of the international system. That change in the nature of the international system in turn informs the worldview of constituents, which changes how states behave, which changes the international environment. And this is a system theory of international relations. And to my knowledge, it's the first major unified one. And it's weird, because it's like, this is so simple, but it does so much work to bridge the gap between realists, constructivists, and neoliberal institutionalists. And that's great international relations scholarship, is explaining a ton with a limited amount. So that's Brommuller's systems theory. His enduring quote from this book is that history constrains those who shape it. Yeah?
So wait, the theory says that only the international environment affects the worldview of constituents. Why would the state and the state itself affect that?
It certainly would. I don't want to suggest that constituents don't pay attention to how the state interacts, I guess, with its own population, right? But think about it in terms of a fairly small constituency. So a fairly small constituency is very much in charge of the mechanisms of the state, and so it doesn't much matter to that small constituency how the state treats the rest of its population. And this is also a little bit more focused on how constituents view the international system. So I think that that's a fair point. So for example, like, say, North Korea. Well, that is an instance of the worldview of the major constituents, which is to say the Kim family and the military, informing the behavior of the states, which informs its international interactions. But then the state tells its constituents also the world is fundamentally imperialist and out to get you, right? Okay, so that's the nested politics model. Very powerful piece of theory. I'm not quite sure how it fits into debate yet, but that's part of the idea. I think part of it might be that this is an interesting way of understanding a permutation, because it does so much work to bridge those competing understandings. And that's part of the fun of looking for new international relations theory and always being on the lookout, being vigilant for great new books, because it can help you construct interesting new arguments rather than sort of being trapped in the same cycle of realism versus constructivism. All right. Like we said, struggled in some ways to articulate a unified theory of international politics, but that's okay, because one of the major contributions of constructivist authors is to open the gate for other, far more nuanced critical approaches to international relations, which I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about in a couple of the subsequent lectures. So understanding, for example, how social constructions of gender impact how states interact with one another, how the international system is viewed. I imagine some of you have come across the work of Tigner. Yes, very famous gender theorist in international politics. I would also recommend to any of you who are interested a journal called Signs. Signs produces really good and very accessible work in feminist international relations. The social construction of the international environment also has opened the door to things like securitization theory. And you all, I trust you all have heard at least the word securitization. What is that?
Looked at it a
Phenomenon.
Yeah, it's been looked at it. What is it?
Getting secure. Yes?
Where states try to control populations.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that to some extent, that can be an outcome. Sure. But securitization theory in its kind of original manifestation. So, for a long time, international relations as a field was concerned with what we would call classic security threats. So, the military threat posed by one state to another state. Classic security problems. Securitization theorists like Barry Buzan and Ole Weaver, who were some of the first to write really accessible mainstream securitization theory, basically make the argument that issues and transnational problems that can impact the security of populations can also be understood as threats to state security. So for example, disease spread, global warming, I guess transnational terrorism kind of bridges the gap, organized crime. These are all examples of security problems that can be understood to impact the security of states. So not just direct military threats from other states. And so the study of securitization is the study of how elites manipulate language in order to construct some phenomenon as a threat to the security of the state or the nation, and then mobilize resources against that threat. So some of those famous papers that came out a couple of years ago explaining climate change as a threat to national security. Turns out it can possibly be more effective to explain it as a threat to national security in order to get those with the levers those with controls of the levers of power and those with control over state resources to respond, rather than just explaining it as we're going to get flooded, man. We're going to get flooded, and things are also going to get very dry. Securitization constructs it as a threat to state security in order to mobilize resources. So there are instances where that might do a great deal of social good. Things like combating organized crime, things like combating climate change. It also is very possible that that elite language game, that elite manipulation of language in order to construct something as a security threat, will enable the state to mobilize resources against populations or phenomena that are not, objectively speaking, threats to state security. But for highly politicized reasons, the elite language game seeks to exterminate those people for that phenomenon. So that's securitization, threat construction. Ole Weaver, Barry Buzan, subsequently Dylan, Campbell, those are some of the famous authors in securitization. Okay. We leave a little bit of time for questions for our passing period. So questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, gripes, diatribes. Yes?
So it seems like all these theories have like a fair amount of evidence and reasoning to like back them up. So how does the clash work in a debate between like why I say this and why I say this too?
That's a really good question. So, I think that a lot of the places, most of the time, where these competing worldviews happen, at least in straight-up debates, are in impact scenarios. And it's about the probability that states will go to war with one another. Because we have this competitive incentive to focus on interstate war, eventually, of course, leading to nuclear annihilation. And so I think that the best thing to do if, say, you want to go hard for liberal institutionalist impact defense, and then obviously something else that is offensive, I think that adding as many examples as possible from the extant literature would be very helpful. I also think that making comments on the broad changes that are occurring within the international relations field, so the community of scholars, would be very, very important. So for example, it would probably greatly lend to your credibility to point out that there are, to my knowledge, at least virtually no classical realist authors publishing in major journals in international relations, because the field has moved past that and there's a consensus among the experts that the world doesn't work in that way, or at least the world works in a far more nuanced way, and that would, I think, lend credence to maybe your liberal institutionalist arguments. Others? Yeah?
Can you explain the third back up to the one again?
Sure. So, states interact with one another, and that creates the structure of the international environment.
Okay.
The interactions between these states in the international environment inform the constituents' worldview.
Okay.
So, constituents have a cooperative worldview. They start cooperating with a whole domain of states. That cooperation begets further cooperation and so forth. I think to some extent, I mean, my reading of this is that there's a certain path dependence to it, but I don't know that Brommuller would necessarily agree with that. Yes?
Within the constructivism, where do international organizations fall into that?
That's a good question. So international organizations for a lot of constructivists are very important forums for norm entrepreneurs. So people who make arguments about the way that the international system ought to work in order to benefit people who are not the elites within states. So constructivists, these norm entrepreneurs, for example, international organizations were considered the main forum for, say, like landmine bans, right? That's a kind of classic example from the constructivist literature of how a group of norm entrepreneurs lobbied international organizations and at least got some states to stop putting landmines. Others? Yes?
Would you mind walking through Fearon's commitment problem
Sure.
once more?
Sure, okay. So, within that bargaining model of work, the rationalists, and Fearon in particular, imports that assumption from neo-realism that the world is fundamentally anarchic, which means that no international organization can actually credibly constrain state behavior. So what that means is that when states make commitments to not fight one another, those promises to each other are not credible, because no unbiased, powerful third party will enforce the agreement. And so, states fear the future in a world of anarchy. And so, because states fear the future and they fear reductions in their relative material standing, they're scared that they'll get disadvantaged by the more powerful state later. So it is better to attack now than risk being disadvantaged into the future. And so that's how war can happen, even in a world of perfect information, via the commitment problem, according to the bargaining model. Yes?
So in rationalism, people believe that they believe that international organizations are uncredible, all of them?
Pretty much, for the bargaining model of war. I mean, I think rationalists would all concede that there's far more nuance to it, that international organizations are good at solving some problems. Making sure that state commitments to not engage in violence, that's not one. So, yeah, rationalism is strongly informed by some of the assumptions of the Okay, yeah.
Is there one theory that is like more agreed upon than others?
Okay, so good question. I would suggest, and this may just be my own bias in how I read the literature and how I was trained, rationalism has come to be a very dominant perspective in international relations, and I think that neo-realism very much remains a dominant perspective. Constructivism is a little bit more outside the mainstream. I think a major part of the reason for that is, like I had mentioned previously, it has been difficult for constructivists to articulate unified and falsifiable theories of international relations. And the community of international scholars, at least in the United States, this is less true in Europe, we do love unified, falsifiable theories. But outside of the United States, constructivism is considerably more mainstream. So I would suggest that in Europe and a lot of Canadian institutions, constructivism is pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, when you talk about the securitization and how like they construct language to
Yes.
about like how they like they frame it to like a threat and stuff, like marijuana is one of them, like how they use language to like.
That marijuana is a threat to national security?
Yeah.
I don't know that it's the most credible example of securitization, but
What would be a good example of that?
of securitization. So, like we talked about global warming, suggesting that global warming is a threat to national security because it's a threat to the body politic, and therefore, if we understand it as a threat to state or national security, resources can be mobilized against it. That is kind of the classic example of securitization. But disease spread, there are a couple of very interesting articles that came out, actually mostly by Australians, about how avian influenza outbreak became securitized in Southeast Asia, and how different types of states securitize differently. It's really interesting. Yes?
This is more just a general securitization question. How do you think of using securitization rhetoric against something like marijuana or any other threat actually makes that threat real and impacts us in a more like legitimate to securitization threatening way, or threatening the security of the state?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, and that's exactly what securitization, as its own little field of study, seeks to explain: is when does securitization succeed in mobilizing resources, and when does it fail? It is, in some ways, I think a little bit less concerned about the outcome, whether or not those resources are mobilized effectively to get rid of the problem, but whether they become mobilized in the first place. Because the question of whether they're mobilized is answered by how well the securitization discourse is constructed. So, for example, trying to securitize an issue like marijuana when a significant portion of the body politic would probably not be persuaded that it is a significant threat to international security, would probably lead to a failed attempt at securitization. Whereas the overwhelming evidence in favor of the detrimental effects of things like climate change or disease outbreak would greatly aid in the process of securitization and increase the probability that those resources would get mobilized. Okay. One last quick thing before you all had to talk at the water cooler about all this awesome stuff. So, journals in international relations, if you want to keep up on it. So for debaters, especially debaters who don't have a ton of background in IR, I would recommend a journal called International Security. This is a journal that has a lot of qualitative and historical work as opposed to quantitative work, so it's very easy to read, and lots of really, really excellent authors publish in international security. If you're feeling adventurous, IO, or international organization. A lot of really groundbreaking and fascinating work has been produced in international organization. The caveat is that it can be pretty highly technical and not as accessible to non-specialists. International Studies Quarterly, International Interaction, all very good. Occasionally, really excellent work on international relations will get produced in the American Political Science Review or the American Journal of Political Science, the European Journal of Political Science. Of course, if you're really looking to kind of start from the beginning, Foreign Affairs is good, and Foreign Policy is Foreign Policy is a website, but it's really fun. You'll see international relations theorists behaving badly on foreign policy. It's very good. All right, thanks a lot.